At today's Phoenix DevOps meetup, Rob is going to be teaching us about how to use DevOps, or Azure DevOps and Kubernetes and deploy applications. Uh, Rob is a member of the Phoenix and Bay Area, California technology communities, and really helps clients get their applications modernized and on the cloud and so forth. So with that, I'd like to hand it over to Rob and we'll get going.
Awesome. Thank you. It's great to be here. I'm really excited to talk about Azure DevOps and Azure Kubernetes. I don't have any slides, so that's it. That's my slides. I have no slides under this arm. No, I'm just kidding. Everything that we're going to build today, you can get to from my site. Here's the point where I say, I'm definitely going to post the stuff on my site tonight. You're going to go look tonight, next week, next month. In about 3 months, you're going to get tired of waiting. You're going to email me. In about 6 months, I'm going to reply and say, no, I'm definitely going to post it on my site tonight. And I'll never post it at all, which is why you can go to robrich.org right now and click on presentations. And you can scroll down to level up your DevOps with Azure and Kubernetes. And you can get to the code that we're about to build today. So right now, when you load up that URL, you get to this wonderfully empty repository because we haven't built it yet. But so that'll be really fun to dig into. But I'm on my way to Kansas City for Kansas City Developer Conference. So join us in Kansas City, and that'll be really cool too. While you're here, click on About Me. And you'll get to this page and see some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Microsoft MVP. I'm a friend of Redgate. AZ Give Camp is really fun. AZ Give Camp brings volunteer developers together with charities who otherwise couldn't afford software services. We start building software Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver that software back to the charities. So it is a really, really fun thing. Come join us. Our next event is our annual event is usually in March. And so sign up at meetup.com/azgivecamp. Some of the other things that I've done, SQL Source Control Basics, minus Chapter 7. That was pretty cool. I worked on Gulp in version 2 and version 3. And I do Git and Docker and Kubernetes training through GitGrid. So you can have me do this for your organization if you'd like. One of the things I'm particularly proud of is I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air, and they sent me a mug. Woohoo! So that was a lot of fun. We're here to learn about Azure DevOps. And in particular, using Azure DevOps to deploy Kubernetes resources. So here's Azure DevOps. I just went to dev.azure.com. I signed in with my Microsoft account, and I was taken to this portal. I don't have any projects created yet here in this Rob Rich organization, so we'll build one today. The one thing that I did do is I went into the Azure portal, portal.azure.com, and I created an Azure Kubernetes service. This is the managed Azure piece. The really cool thing about Azure Kubernetes service is that Kubernetes has a management tier, a control plane, and then the worker nodes, the machines that actually do the work. Inside Azure Kubernetes service, you don't pay for the control plane at all. It's a managed control plane, and they do it all for you. You pick the version that you want from the dropdown, and it just provisions all the things. So I provisioned that Azure Kubernetes service, AKS. It takes about 10 minutes to spin up, so it's already done. I also spun up an Azure Container Registry, a private Docker Hub registry, where we can upload our containers, our images, so that we don't need to publish them publicly if we'd like. The next thing that I did was I linked the Azure Container Registry together with the Azure Kubernetes service. So I went and grabbed my client ID from Kubernetes service. I went and grabbed the ACR ID, the registry name. And then using role-based access control, RBAC, I linked those two so that the service principal that runs all of the Kubernetes jobs is able to reach into the container registry to be able to pull content. So that's already done as well. But that process is relatively straightforward. So, you know, fire up PowerShell or Bash or whatever you're going to do and just go grab those pieces and set them in place. So we've got Azure Kubernetes Service, AKS. We've got Azure Container Registry, ACR. And now we're ready to go. Creating a new project. Well, our goal is to take a website and publish it, get that to kick off a build, and get the build to do stuff. So let's start off inside of this empty directory, not that one, this one, and let's build a website. CD src, that directory is currently empty, and let's create that website. Now I'm just using the .NET CLI. Oh, that's not what I expected to copy. I'm just using the .NET CLI just to spin up a really quick website. We could do a similar thing with Node. We could build a Java site. We're here, so this .NET website is really easy to do. So we've got our .NET website. That's pretty sweet. Looking through this website, we have a controller that just will identify the URL and serve particular content. And then views, here's that index view that just says, hey, hello, welcome, hello world. This one will use a master page, a layout page. And here on this layout page, we'll say Azure DevOps. So that's that title at the top of the page. We'll do that here, and we'll do that here. And so now we have a little bit of customization in that page. That's pretty sweet. So the first step in getting this into Kubernetes, Kubernetes kind of starts with, so I have a Docker container. So let's build a Docker container out of this. Let's close up the views folder. I'm going to create a file, and this is specifically a Docker file. It's not dockerfile.txt, though that's really easy to do. It is very specifically a Docker file. And this Docker file is instructions that we'll use of how to build this Docker image. So we start off and we say from, and what's our base image? Well, let's head off to Docker Hub and let's take a look at Docker Hub. We'll search for .NET. Yeah, let's go to .NET Core, and we get to this page right here where we see various groups of .NET Core images. So we have one for the SDK. We have one for ASP.NET Runtime. If you're looking to do some interesting things with Docker, with .NET, the samples repo is really cool. But we're after the SDK. We want to build our website. So let's pop open that page. Here's that .NET Core SDK. And it says featured tags. Here's that image name. And we notice that it's not actually pulled from Docker Hub. It's pulled from Microsoft's container registry. Bummer, but that's okay. So we'll start off and we'll say from that base image. Let's go grab that again. I had a copy paste fail. Copy. Paste. Okay. And we're going to use the 3.0 Alpine label. Alpine is a really, really small Linux distribution, so that makes this image a lot smaller. We're using .NET Core 3.0, so that makes sense. Copy. We want to copy everything from our current directory on our host into this image. So I copy everything from my host directory, that current directory, into the image at the current directory. Well, what's that current directory? Workdir/src. I'll just say, that's my current directory. It could be anything, but that one's a good one. run .NET restore. .NET restore will start to restore some of my dependencies, all of my NuGet packages. We can kind of think of this like an NPM registry, or we could pull in pip packages. In this case, it's a .NET project, so we've grabbed our .NET packages. Well, I really want to do this restore before I copy in everything. Docker will cache each of the layers, and so whenever anything changes in my source code, it's going to reinstall my NuGet packages. That may be kind of intense, so let's move that above there. Well, now what is it going to restore? Well, let's copy in the manifest, site.csproj, into that current directory. Now it knows enough to be able to restore those NuGet packages. It will copy in this manifest, restore the NuGet packages, and then copy in everything else. So if my C# code or my HTML code or my JavaScript code changes, it doesn't need to restore all of my dependencies again. So I can have that faster inner loop, which is really cool. Well, I'm going to copy everything. There's some things that I may not want to copy, like local built content, user files. So let's add another file. We'll call this .docker ignore. And this Docker ignore file will be all of the things that I don't want to copy as I copy in everything. So here I'll include bin obj star.user, those things that I don't want in a production build. Here in properties is this launch settings.json that also is debug content, so I'll exclude that one. I may also exclude the .vs folder, star.log, ds_image, and other things that I don't want to end up in my production container that may happen to be in my source code directory. Since we're going for production, I'll also exclude this app settings.development.json. And so now when I say copy everything, it will copy everything except for all of those things that I've chosen to exclude. So that's great. I have all of my source code here in my image, and now I can build. .NET build. I'm going to build in release mode. And now I could do things like run .NET test, run all of my unit tests. And I may have other parameters there. In this case, we don't have any tests in our project, so we'll just ignore that line. But that's that spot where I would kick off all of my tests after I've built before I do other things. If my tests pass, then I want to continue on. Next up, run .NET publish -c release -o dist. This .NET publish step will take all of my content, all of my HTML and JavaScript, together with all of the built things, all of my DLLs, but it won't include my source code. So this is that piece that I then want to copy to my production server. I don't need my source code in my production container. I only need the content in this dist directory. That's perfect. So I'm going to say workdir/app run scp, or actually, guys, cp dist to /app, and then cmd.net site.dll. That will kick off my website. Now, I do need some other environment variables just to kind of tell it how to kick up in production, how to expose the port. I'm going to tell, oops, copy, paste, fail. Copy, paste. I'm going to tell it that it should launch the server on port 80, listening on all IP addresses. I'm going to tell it that it needs to run in production mode. And then I'll give Docker some metadata that says, I think my web server is running on port 80. You should allow inbound traffic on port 80. Now that's okay, this would run just fine in production, but this image now includes our source code that we copied in here. It includes the build tools that we used as our base image. So let's see if we can kind of split these in half and say, well, you know, I really want only my production content from here down. So back in Docker Hub, we're going to go to look at the .NET repos, and we see that we've got one called ASP.NET. That's perfect. Let's dig into that one. We've got this base image, and we can scroll down and look at the labels again, and we're going to use that 3.0 Alpine label. So I'm going to say right here, from that ASP.NET runtime image, 3.0 Alpine, and now it kind of created a new build step. So it started over here, and it created a new image, and it's now only going to copy in that content that we need to run in our production image. Well, now instead of this run SCP, we're not copying it from elsewhere on the drive. We want to do one of these copy commands, but we're not copying it from our host machine. We're copying it from this stage up here. So let's say copy -- from equals build. And now we'll copy it from that build stage. Let's name this one as build. And now we've got our production runtime image. And we have our, for lack of a better term, build server image. This top one includes all of our source code, all of our build tools. This bottom one only includes the runtime details, only the things that we want to launch on our web server. Any questions so far? Awesome. So we've got our Docker file. Our Docker file will, links to this Docker ignore so that we don't get more content in than we want. And we have our website with some interesting customizations so that we can see that that's the website that we're looking for. Awesome. Now we want to host this on Kubernetes, so we're not just going to do a Docker build. We're actually going to do a Docker build and then deploy through Kubernetes content. So I'm going to go look at this file. Let's actually do it this way. I'm going to go grab this file and stick it inside of our source directory. And now our source directory is right here, the one with all of our C# source code and HTML code, our Docker file. Parallel to that is this netapp.yaml file, this Kubernetes file. And like any good developer, I went to the previous project and I copied and pasted it into this project and I changed a few things. But this specifies all of those Docker runtime details, all of the things that we would type in our Docker run command so that we can then fire this up on Kubernetes. So here's that template that says, here's what I want this Kubernetes pod to be. Well, I'll add a little bit of metadata. I'll call it netapp. The version will be v-buildnum. Hopefully we can swap that out with the actual build number. It's going to use this container, this netapp container. And it's going to pull it from that Azure Container Registry. Hopefully we can swap that URL out in time. And it's going to expose it on port 80. So that's kind of the definition of our pod. It contains a single container. That container is the one that we've built in using that Docker file. And that deployment then goes into Kubernetes so that it can spin up as many pods as it needs to support it. Right now, I've only asked it to spin up one pod, but if I wanted to scale horizontally, I could spin that up to 2 or 2,000. That makes for a really interesting demo. I'll just leave it on 1 right now. We've got 1 instance of this pod, 1 instance of this container. Now, we do want to expose it through Kubernetes out to the world, so we'll create a service. Now, this service very specifically will look for selector of app:/NetApp. Now this selector is just the labels that need to exist on that other pod. And so here we've very specifically labeled it with app:/NetApp. Now we've also labeled it with the version just so that we can kind of see it in interesting ways. It must have at minimum this selector, but ours just happen to have more, and that's totally fine. We're going to say, I would like you to map port 80 into port 80, because Kubernetes. And now we've got our service. Any traffic coming into the service on port 80 will go round robin across all of the pods and will route to the appropriate pod that will be able to take our traffic. Now we want to take that a step further and we want to expose that to the internet. So we're going to add another thing, an ingress controller here that says, I'm going to use the HTTP application routing piece of Azure Kubernetes service. And I'm going to go based on that NetApp AKS URL. And I'm going to allow public traffic in on port 80. And I'm going to route that to my backend. So any traffic that comes into this URL will route to that NetApp service. The NetApp service will go find the pods that match. And the pods ultimately will run that container that we just built that Docker file for. The ingress goes into the service goes into the pod, and the pod routes it to the container. Any questions so far? Now we could specify in here image pull secrets if we wanted to create a Kubernetes secret that pulled our images from Azure Container Registry. We used that RBAC service principal instead. So this is commented out. But if we wanted to, we could create a Kubernetes secret. We could put in our ACR credentials and use that to pull the containers. Okay, what did I change? That's what I changed. So we've got our Kubernetes content, we've got our Docker content, we've got our website. Let's add this to a Git repository. So I'm here in this folder. I'm going to go up one folder so that I have both the Kubernetes content and my website content. Git init, git add everything. Now I probably want to ignore a few things, so let's actually go create a git ignore file as well. Close. New file .git ignore. I also want to ignore bin, obj, star.user.vs, and other content. I don't want that to end up in my Git repository. I may also choose to ignore things like .vscode or star.log. You see this Docker ignore file and this Git ignore file have pretty much the exact same syntax. And what's really cool is if you don't have a Docker ignore file, Docker will actually look for a Git ignore file and use that content instead if it can't find it. So we've got a Git ignore file. Let's add everything. Git commit -m initial commit, because apparently that's the commit message for every initial commit ever. And let's go back to GitHub, and let's go grab that GitHub URL. Git remote -v. We don't have any remotes yet. Git remote add origin, and we'll give it that URL. Git push origin master. Okay, we've built our website. We have our Docker content. We have our Kubernetes content, and we've now got it up on GitHub. We could have pushed it to Bitbucket. We could have pushed it to Azure DevOps repositories. But GitHub is a perfect place for this. So we've got our content in place. We've pushed it up to GitHub. And now we want to take action on that inside Azure DevOps. Yeah, it took us a little bit to get here where we could start spinning up Azure DevOps, but now we're ready. We've got our application ready to go. Project name. Azure DevOps AKS, that works. We can make this a public project or a private project. Create project. Azure DevOps itself is free, and you can scale it up by adding more build agents, more build minutes. But for both open and closed source projects, you have a certain amount of free build minutes, which is included in your Azure DevOps account, which is really cool. So I just spun up this project. It's ready to go. I'm going to come into project settings, and I'm going to adjust a few things. Now, Azure DevOps is actually 5 separate products, kind of under that Azure DevOps umbrella. We have boards. Well, we're going to use Jira for that, or Trello, or whatever other build service we need. So we're not going to use that. Repos, we used GitHub for that, so we're not going to include that. Azure Pipelines is that build process. Artifacts is that mechanism of publishing private NPM packages or private NuGet packages. We'll leave that on, but we won't use that today. But you notice once I've done this and saved my details, actually, I don't think there is a save button. It did it automatically. Now when I come in here, those parts of Azure DevOps are gone. Well, they're not gone, they're just hidden. I don't have a whole bunch of clutter in my UI because I chose to exclude those certain products. I don't need those. I'm using services elsewhere for those. We want to build a DevOps pipeline. So let's dig into pipelines. A new pipeline. First off, where is my source code? I could have put it in Bitbucket. I could have put it in Azure DevOps repositories, any generic Git repository, but we put it in GitHub, so that's perfect. Let's go grab our GitHub URL. Does DevOps not support Bitbucket server? As you pick a repository, is it going to let me go back? You can pass it. Nope, it's not. One of those options was just generic Git repository. So given any Git URL, you could plug that in. It doesn't do all of the wizardry associated with Bitbucket server specifically, but if it's a Git repository and I can get at it, authenticated or otherwise, then it will show me those results. Right. Yeah, exactly. We need to. It is possible to use webhooks to trigger things, and we'll come back to that because that's really cool. In particular, as I'm linking this GitHub repository, it's actually going to install the GitHub webhook. So it asked me to authenticate to GitHub. I've done that previously, so it's now just showing me the repositories that I have in my GitHub account. Rob Rich Azure DevOps AKS, that's the repository that we just pushed to. And so now it's saying, hey, can I do stuff? Can I write the GitHub webhook? Can I read all of the content associated with that? And I'm going to say, yes, you can do that. The hardest part of this demo is remembering my password. And now, of course, I have to log back into Azure DevOps because apparently I wasn't signed in all of the way, I guess. OK, so I've linked my GitHub repository to Azure DevOps. And now it's going to ask me, what do I want to do to build my software? I can go look for an existing Azure DevOps YAML file. Or in this case, because we don't have one yet, we'll start with a starter pipeline. Now this Azure pipelines.yaml is that instruction set that Azure DevOps is going to use to build out my project. It's a YAML file. It's committed into our repository. And so we can edit it either here in the portal, saving back to GitHub, or in VS Code as we're developing our source code. I'm going to save and run just to get this into our repository. Breaking all the rules, committing directly to master. Now, ultimately, this build doesn't do anything yet, so let's cancel this build straight away. Yes, I really do want to cancel it. Okay. Builds. Here's that build. I'm going to go back and edit. Now, we just saved it just to kind of get it in place, and also to pop up this tasks view. This will help me craft the YAML statements here in my repository. Now, right now, it's going to trigger off of commits to master. It's going to grab an Ubuntu box, and it's going to say, hello world, and some other things. That's fine. But we want to do a few more things than that. Here in the steps, I'm going to make some space. We want to do a Docker build. So here's a Docker. Oh, that was cool. While we're here, I have Docker. I have Docker Compose. So if we want to just hand it the Compose file and say, go figure out all the things. But we're going to do a Docker build here. The container registry. Oh, we need a container registry. So let's come out back to our project. And let's build in some integrations. Integrations, project settings, service connections. Now we see that we already have that service connection into GitHub. We set that up as we built out the pipeline, as we linked our source code to get the webhook into place. But we also want to build out some other service connections. We would like to be able to push to Kubernetes. So we'll pick Kubernetes, and we'll say, yeah, I'd like to use my Azure subscription. We could also include a service account directly using RBAC, or just a kubeconfig file. In this case, because we say Azure subscription, we can actually pick from the subscriptions that we're logged into, and I'm logged into 4. Let me double check that. Yep, I'm logged into 4, and then it will show me the clusters that I have associated with that repository. Of course, it's going to make me log in again. And now I pick that AKS cluster that we had set up previously. What namespace do I want to deploy into? Well, we don't have any namespaces defined. Probably we'll want to have a namespace per product or per division, some way of kind of containing these. For now, we'll just put it in the default namespace so that we can type less as we do kubectl commands. And now it will go create that service account. It will link the RBAC permissions so that DevOps can trigger AKS commands. That's perfect. We want another service connection here where we can push to a Docker registry. We'll do a similar thing, Azure Container Registry. It will go ask us for our subscription. It'll ask us for our container registry. Of course, I haven't logged in 5 seconds ago, so it's going to go double check. Would you like to stay signed in? What's really fun is to do that in a incognito browser, because yeah, it's going to ask me all the time. So I'll link to that Azure Container Registry, and I'll name that Rob Rich ACR. Similar thing, it will set up the service principal in Azure DevOps. It will link that service principal with the correct permissions inside Azure Container Registry. And so now I have permission to pull content from GitHub and write that Azure pipelines.yaml file. I have permission after I finish building my Docker container to push that up to the private Azure Container Registry Docker registry. and I have permission to kick off tasks inside of Azure Kubernetes service. Any questions there? Yep. Best practices for Azure Container Registries. Do you want one per project or one per division or maybe one for the entire company? It probably depends a lot on the governance that you have around that. You know, must we use the same base images? Is ops going to publish those base images? Could we maybe share containers cross-department? What are our naming conventions? Best practices, have a chat with your team and explore. You'll make the wrong decision once or twice, that's fine. And then, you know, adjust. I tend to find fewer registries is usually easier to manage, but those registries tend to get large. And so, you know, then we start splitting them up once they get large. That was a great question. What other questions do you have so far right here? Yep.
So how much of the configuration of the Kubernetes cluster do you know if that's available to you via
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I could have scaffolded the Azure Container Registry and Azure Kubernetes Service either using ARM templates or using Terraform files. In this case, I chose to just push buttons in the portal because I was only creating one. But yeah, getting all of that content in place, and in particular, even getting these service connections in place, you can script all of that, which makes that a whole lot easier. Today, we're pushing buttons, so I push buttons here too. Okay, so we've got the permission now to do it. Let's drive back into our pipeline, into our builds. I'm going to edit this build. And we would like a Docker task. This Docker task will go against that container registry that we just set up. And the most confusing question of all, the container registry, actually what they're asking is the image name, NetApp. And we want to do a build and push. We could also specify things like where is the Docker file. In our case, it's inside the SRC directory. So, you know, any directory, find the Docker file, that's perfect. The build context is wherever it found that Docker file. And then what are the tags? We could say the build ID. The build ID is a sequential number, 1, 2, 3. I would like to use the build number because that's going to be a little bit more legible. That'll be, you know, roughly the date and then a sequential number. But we could also abuse things like latest and push up latest and do interesting things. So this just helped us form that content here in the YAML file. So we're going to say add, and it's going to dump in that content here into YAML. We could have just typed that YAML. It was kind of fun to use the tool to do that. But here I'm going to say, well, I know that this is a little bit gentler YAML. And in particular, I want my thing to be v dash build number rather than just the build number, because that's the way I specified it here in my Kubernetes file. I just wanted to do v dash build number. Okay, so we've got that task. We're going to do the Docker build. We're going to push directly to that registry. And now we've got a lot of these things here in this Azure Kubernetes file that we need to replace with specific build variables. So we've got build num. Let's come back in here and we'll say, let's misuse this one. Replace K8s variables. Let's cat K8s netapp.yaml, pipe it to sed. We're going to look for that. We're going to replace it with build.buildNumber G. We also want to grab AKS URL and replace that with AKS URL G, S. And here's where I start leaning on, not that one. Because it's fun to watch me type. We'll go grab all of those things. Let's swap in build number. Let's swap in AKS URL, ACR URL, and we'll just replace all of those details in our YAML file so that we have the details out of the build. Those secrets didn't end up in our source code. Now we could use Helm. That would be a much more durable way to do this, but we're here. Yep.
So I have a question about what the build agent is running. You're using a command like cat and sed.
Mm-hmm.
So you assume that those commands are available in the build agent.
Right.
What is the build agent?
Good call. What is the build agent? If I'm using sed and cat, right here, I've chosen this build agent to be the Ubuntu latest image. I could also choose a Windows server. I could choose a Red Hat server. I could choose my own image. But in this case, because I chose Ubuntu, yeah, I can assume that sed and cat are available. That was a great question.
So on line 27, using the new Linux sed, you can just skip the cat and use -i.
Yeah. Yeah, this script is pretty ugly. I could have done a -i and pulled in the file or redirected the file in instead of catting it, you know. Yeah. I don't know. The guy who wrote the script was kind of goofy. Okay, so we've changed this file, and now we want to make this file available as a build artifact so that we can use that to kick off the Kubernetes content. So I'm going to reach into the secret stash again. And actually, before I do that, let me nuke this hello world one. We want to copy files. So I'm going to grab the K8s folder. I'm going to grab all the content, though we only have one file in there right now. And I want that target folder to be the build.buildartifacts directory. I'm not positive that's the exact name. Let me go look for it. Artifact staging directory. I can never remember that name, but it's like, go copy this file and put it in this artifact staging directory, the place that they expect artifacts to be. I'll add that task. And then one more task that I want to put in here, publish build artifacts. I want to publish that artifact staging directory. What do I want to name my artifact? Drop. That's awful, but okay. And where do I want to publish it to? I want to publish it to Azure Pipelines. I want to be able to use that later in my release task. Okay. Oh, that was ugly. So I've got then these 4 tasks in my YAML file. I'm going to build the Docker file. I'm going to then push that, tag that with v-build number. I'm going to then push that to my Azure Container Registry. I'm going to replace some content in my YAML file because I'm too lazy to use Helm. I'm going to copy that folder into this build artifacts spot, and then I'm going to publish that as part of my build artifacts. Those are the 4 tasks that we want to do in this pipeline. We might also want to do things like run our unit tests, version our source code in interesting ways, or publish that version number into our source code. You know, maybe kick off integration tests. But this pipeline's looking pretty good for now. Save. Save. And now that's going to go kick off a build. Ooh, that build failed. The pipeline is not yet valid. The Docker input container registry references service connection, and I haven't given the service connection permission to do that. Would I like to do that? Yes, I would. Why do I need to authorize it twice? Okay, let's queue another build. Based on refs heads master, we could do some other cool things. Oh, before we do that, we need to go look at some of the variables. The build number was defined previously, but we haven't yet defined what the AKS URL is and what the ACR URL is. So let's go here into edit, and I'm gonna go in here to variables. Triggers is really fun as well, where I can say only these branches kick off builds or build pull requests. But I'm gonna specifically dig into variables. And I would like 2 variables. I'll add ACR URL, and that I will get here from my container registry. I'll grab that login server. That's the URL of my registry. Copy, paste, fail. Copy. Paste. I'm going to add another one, AKS URL, and I will get that URL from my Azure Kubernetes cluster. This HTTP application routing domain. We're going to come back to that one. But another secret that I don't want to save into my source code, I want my build server to know this and just apply it at the correct spot. Okay, so we've got our pipeline. Let's queue a new build. We're going to do it off the master branch, or we could pick a particular thing. We could also override variables in interesting ways. Let's not in this case. Let's just queue it, and it will go kick off a build. Now this is interesting. Watching it could be really fun. Let's come back to that. But ultimately, that's going to build the thing, but it's not yet deployed it. It's not released it yet. So let's build up a release pipeline. Before we kick off releases, any questions on the build? Yeah, the previous builds are already over. The variables will get injected into the new builds. Yeah, one of the tricks I like to do is one of those commands, I'll just say set, and it will dump out all my environment variables. And I'm like, oh yeah, that's why I spelled it wrong. Yeah. When I queued the build, I could have built a particular Git hash. In this case, I just said build master, build latest. And so it was able to do that. I just left it blank. But I could have said, build that thing from a few months ago, build that thing from last week. And so I could have specified it there. Is there a way to retrieve the hash if I want to use it in my build? I've got the Git content right there. I can just use Git head, and it will spit out the URL. Not the URL, the Git hash. And I actually recommend doing that. Go grab the Git hash and save it somewhere in your source code so that as it builds, you can then reflect in your source code and see what Git hash built it. That's really effective. Okay, so I'm kind of curious if that build succeeded. Yes, it succeeded. That was cool. Here's our build. It did all of the tasks. Check out all of our there aren't any tests. And kind of a summary of all the things that it did. What's cool is we could dig into each section and we could actually see the console output as it did each of those tasks. And so that's really fun. We now have, yep. Can I link to a line in this output? I've never tried to do that. That sounds really interesting. Yeah, it does have line numbers. Yeah. There's that link to exactly that line. That's cool. Yeah, that was awesome. I learned something today. So we've done our build, and the result of our build was to publish these build artifacts, that Kubernetes file, that we'll use to trigger our release. Releases. I would like a new release pipeline, and this release pipeline then specifies the steps to take that built content and to deploy it to all the servers that I need to. Select a template. I would like to select Kubernetes to deploy to a Kubernetes cluster. Yeah, that sounds awesome. If I wasn't so lazy and actually used Helm, then I would just grab this Helm chart instead. Apply. What's my stage name? AKS deploy. DevOps, AKS. Is that right? Azure DevOps AKS. Okay. So that just kind of defined that one stage. It doesn't do anything yet, but let's back up a smidge and say, well, what should kick this off? Let's add an artifact. Well, we would like it to be a build artifact based on this project, the build pipeline that we just built. What version do we want? We would like latest. The source alias. What do we call it downstream, basically, is what it's asking. And Azure DevOps AKS sounds fine. So we now have a build artifact that can start us off. I'm going to trigger this, and I'm going to say, whenever a new thing shows up, kick off this release. We could also add filters to say, but only do it if it's built off the master branch. Don't publish any of the other branches. Or we could do other things like somebody must kick off a pull request to do it. And so we can do some interesting filters there. So right now, we're going to say we would like to create a release anytime a new build is available, but we won't include any other filters there. So now I have that little check mark next to the lightning bolt, which, by the way, is really, really hard to see. OK, so I've got that thing, and it's going to go kick off this thing. Now, similarly, I could now select some triggers, like I would like to have pre-deployment approvals. Only do this if this user says that's OK. So they're going to get an email, they're going to click the link in the email, and they're going to push the approve button, and then this release will happen. So that's really cool. So what is it going to do? Oh, I don't want it to do that. I do want it to do that. So after every release, this process will, or after every artifact is published, then this process will kick off. What's it going to do? Let's fire this up. Now, we asked for the Kubernetes template, so it gave us this job straight away. It hasn't configured it yet because it didn't know what arguments we wanted for it. But we can then go say, remember that Azure Kubernetes service that we configured in the service connections? We'd like to use that. What namespace? Default. What's the command that we want to run? Well, we want to run apply. What's the arguments? The arguments are -f drop. Remember, we called that artifact the drop artifact. So when it's grabbed it and put it into that folder, it's the drop artifact. So we'll run all of the things there in that folder. We currently only have one thing, so it'll only do that one. What's the working directory? Well, we would like to not just do it in this main build directory, but we would actually like to do it in this drop directory. Or actually, no, we do want to do it in this root directory. But we could walk through those artifacts and kind of pick the spot where we want to do this. So we're very specifically doing that in that artifact directory so that we have that artifact available. If we wanted to, nope. So now that we've got that set, we will save that detail. And now we've kind of defined that release process. We could also identify variables, other options, see the history of how this build has changed. But now we've got that release pipeline set up, which is really cool. There's a button that I went looking for that was spit out the YAML for this release, and I can't find it in 8 seconds, so I'll consider that a demo file. So we've got that, that release pipeline. Nope, all pipelines, releases. No, did I not save it? Let's go do that again. Create, oh, create release. I haven't released it yet. I've built the pipeline, but I haven't released it. Okay. So now we've got our build pipeline and we've got our release pipeline, and the build pipeline will kick off based on a GitHub commit, and the release pipeline will kick off based on a build finishing. So let's kick off a build. I'm going to come in here to builds, and I'm going to say status badge. And it's going to give me some markdown to make a status badge, which is pretty cool. So back here in our repository, let's create a new file, readme.md. We'll add that status badge. Level up your Azure DevOps with Azure Kubernetes Service. This is the code for the talk at Phoenix DevOps meetup. We'll add this status badge to the top of that repository. Git status, git add readme, git commit, oh, git pull. Let's first go pull all of the things. Oops. Git branch -u origin master, git pull, git log --1 line --graph decorate all. So here's the spots where we were modifying the YAML file, and it was committing that Azure pipelines.yaml file into our repository. So we just pulled that down so that we made sure that our new commit will be above that. Git status, git commit -m, add readme, git push Azure master, no, git push origin master. So we've gotten our build. Our build is ready to go. Waiting for an agent. It found an agent. Our agent is starting to do the work. I love how it pops open each one and it kind of says, here's what I'm going to do. And then as it finishes, it shrinks that one down and pops open the next one. So here's that Docker build process. It's pulling down the .NET base image. That pull is complete. It's now doing the next step in the Docker file. Workdir is src. Next, it's going to do the NuGet restore. Copy in the site.cs proj, the .NET restore. It's doing our build. Copying our built output into that new stage. It doesn't have that new stage yet, so it's going to Docker pull that new stage. Copying that content into the new stage. Setting the environment variables. Labeling that build with all of the labels that we gave it, the v-build number. and the latest. It'll publish those up to our Azure Container Registry. It did that process of grabbing all of the files in the, oh, and this one's going to fail, replacing the variables in the K8s net app YAML. And for some reason, this is pretty flaky. Thus, Helm is a much better task.
So it's actually related to John's question. So the cat, the files being truncated, reading
Right.
via the redirect.
Yeah. It works about half the time. I go into the pipeline and I edit the pipeline and I go looking for a typo here in my thing. You know, like, did I not define the variables correctly? Or, and actually it's lowercase, that's the way I defined it there. Did I not type in that variable correctly? Did I not redirect it? That's why I cat it again right here to see that I've replaced it correctly. I'll then go verify my variables are named correctly. And you know, as I was practicing this, I did this 1,000 times. ACR URL, AKS URL. I come in here and I futz with it and I copy and paste it a couple of times and I replaced this task with a Helm task because that's so much more durable. Oh, that's not the correct save. It just didn't output a file.
Yeah. So that's redirect.
Mm-hmm.
The files go right. Files are cat.
Interesting.
So that's.
Then let's cancel this and show me how to do that correctly.
Yeah, if we put the.
I thought because I catted it before the other pipes kicked up,
Now,
then
so if you change those commands instead, anyone want to do this?
Yeah, so like the order of operations during the shell.
Yeah.
And since we're using the Ubuntu latest image, we use like a Linux shell or a bash probably. So yeah, what you're doing there will work.
like that.
Yep.
Yeah.
Sed-I, K8s, NetApp YAML.
Yep. Yeah.
Cool.
Instead of cat, because bash will interpret that whole line, see the redirect, and truncate the file.
Ah,
Before it's cast the file, so it ends up.
yeah.
And remove the cat.
Oh, yes. Remove the cat. That's cool. Which is why when I do this, redirecting it to a different file name or a different folder, it always worked. Yeah. That's hilarious. So this one where I forgot to remove the cat is definitely not going to work. But this one, yeah, the other wonderful benefit of doing this live on stage is it's like, if nothing works, or if everything doesn't work, then nothing works. This is going to be hilarious. Yeah. I did not remove the redirect at the end.
Yeah, the order in the set command might matter. Like you might give it regular expression first and then the file name last.
Will it read out of that file and write back to that file in one command?
It does its own internal like temp file handle creation.
Okay. So I need to do that and that, and I also need to make these one sed command with multiple steps instead of This is cool. Like that?
I think dash I should go after the set.
The dash I should go right after the sed, not at the end?
And then file name is the last argument.
Ah,
And it says me, but we'll just have to select it, throw it, and see if it works.
okay. Alternatively, I can output this to a new folder and just use that folder going downstream. We can try that next. Save. Save. Here's where I pop up my Ubuntu VM with a test file and go futz with it too. Yes, WSL2 is the Ubuntu box of choice. That's how I figured out the sed command is I kept futzing with it in WSL2. And I was like, yeah. The other thing is I would go grab that script, replace and put it ahead so that I didn't have to wait for the Docker build to finish before I knew if it failed. So now I get to narrate the Docker build again. So it pulled all of the things because it used Azure Container Registry, or because it used the Microsoft Container Registry that is also hosted on Azure. It didn't have to pull it from Docker Hub across the internet into Azure, and thus the pull was a lot faster. Thus, Microsoft hosting their images on their own hub. I'm actually really curious now. Sed-I. Yeah, that works. That's pretty sweet. Oh, good call. Did it get the second one? Yes, it did. Cool. So replace the vars. Yep. So it replaced the vars in the file, output all the things, score. I learned something awesome today. Releases. It kicked off a release and grabbed the artifact and deployed that content through AKS. So if I now go to my Kubernetes cluster, I see nothing. Am I in the wrong? I am. kubectl config use context. There we go. So we see the application got launched 50 seconds ago. We have the deployment. We have the replica set. We have the ingress. Now, one of the things that we did with ingress is we used the HTTP application HTTP application routing extension. And the HTTP application routing extension is a piece built into Azure Kubernetes service that allows us to, by publishing an ingress controller, automatically update the DNS. So if I come in here to networking and I turn that on, then publishing the ingress spins up a load balancer, publishes those DNS entries into that load balancer based on the a subdomain of this HTTP application routing domain. And here's the part where I say, is only recommended for dev test clusters, because there is only a single pod controller behind this. There's only a single pod for the controller manager behind this controller. So it's, if you want to do production things, use the regular Nginx Ingress controller. But this works just fine for dev test. It does take about 10 minutes to publish the URL. So we'll see if that goes. But let's go back into our build and take a look at the site that it published it to. It published it to netapp.blah. So if we go to that site, we will see that we have our website. And our website very specifically says that thing that we did at the beginning of today, which was update the homepage to say Azure DevOps. We took our application, we built our source code, we published our source code to our Git repository of choice. In this case, we chose GitHub. We used Azure Pipelines, Azure Builds to be able to pull that content in. We used Azure Releases to apply that content into our Kubernetes cluster. And all of that was using RBAC to be able to connect those things securely. There was no usernames and passwords. Any questions so far? So this is really cool and simultaneously really frustrating. While I was preparing this talk, Microsoft came out with this really cool preview feature called multi-stage pipelines. So multi-stage pipelines, I'm going to turn that feature on. Now, builds and releases are both stored in the same YAML file, which is awesome. I now have releases in my YAML file. But if I come into pipelines and I say new pipeline, I can say, do I have to refresh to get it to take effect? Preview features, multi-stage pipelines is on. New pipeline, GitHub. It already has that service connection. And now I say, I would like to deploy to Azure Kubernetes Service. And it goes, oh, hey, if you're going to deploy to Azure Kubernetes Service, you probably want to set a few things. You want to set the registry name. You want to set the cluster name. You probably want to set your Docker image name. The hardest part of this talk, remembering my password. No, I really don't want to. So once I've picked my subscription, it will say, here's my cluster, my namespace, default, my registry is there, my image name is going to be netapp, my service port is port 80, validate and configure, and not only will it build out that multi-stage release pipeline with some pretty decent defaults here, but it's also now doing interesting things with this manifest. It actually crafted some Kubernetes content for me as well. And so if I do a git pull, so that we get that content back in our application. Is it going to make me, oh, git status. Modified the everything, interesting. Yes, thank you. I was in Linux mode. So now here in this folder, nope, I have to push save first. Save. Now I get this Azure Pipelines -1.yaml, but I also get this manifest deployment and manifest service. It scaffolded out those Kubernetes files for me. In our case, we did them both in one file, and we separated them here with the dots. But I now have the deployment file that has some sensible defaults, and I also have the service file that has some decent defaults. A type of load balancer is probably a mistake if I want to use Ingress. But with multi-stage builds, that just got a lot easier. So that's really cool too.